Good morning, Year 10. What we're going to look at today in our lesson is part of Chapter 16 within the GCSE textbook. So it's Chapter 16.1, which is a chapter on handling data. Now, the first part of that chapter looks at frequency tables. Now, you will have done part of looking at these as part of your revision for your mock exams, but we're going to just have a look at them in a bit more detail, and as well as calculating summary statistics, so mean, median, mode, range, we're also going to look at how we can compare two sets of grouped data, so the kinds of things we need to look at, the kinds of things we need to mention if we are comparing two sets of data. Okay, so let's have a look at frequency tables first as to why we need or make use of frequency tables. Now, they're very useful if you have a large amount of data. If you haven't got a lot of data, then you can just individually list all of the data items. As soon as you start getting more pieces of data, and especially pieces of continuous data. So if we have a think about and remind ourselves what we mean by continuous data. So continuous data can take any value. Okay, so it's not discrete data. Remember, things like discrete data might be your shoe size, it might be the color of a car, where you have individual individual data items for it. Continuous data is a measurement usually, so it might be your height measured to a certain amount of accuracy, or your weight measured to a certain amount of accuracy. Now, with continuous data, you can put that into what's called a grouped frequency table, where you take each of the data items and you put them within a specified set of intervals. Now, the benefits, you're sometimes asked about this, the benefits of putting them in a group frequency table is that it makes the data easier to manage, especially if you've got a large number of data items. But the problem you have with putting in a group frequency table is that you actually lose the individual data items themselves. So all you know is, say, there might be 10 of them within that range of values, but you don't know what those specific values are. Hence, when we're finding things like the mean, we can only find an estimate of the mean. The same for the median as well. We can only find an estimate, or say which range or which interval that particular value is in. So we can't actually work out the exact mean because we've lost the individual data items. So the sort of summary statistics that we're going to look at calculating today for these frequency tables are the estimated mean. Okay, so we'll get an estimate or an approximation for the mean value for all of the data. We're going to look at the modal class. Okay, so that's the same as the interval. So that's saying in which interval is the mode. And then also the class interval in which the median lies. You remember what the median is? The median is the middle value if you were to put them all in order. Okay, so make sure you've written any notes down on that you want to. If you haven't, then just pause it and write them down. What we're going to do now is go on to an example of doing just that. So here's our example. Now, what I'd like you to do is to write that down into your books. So copy the table down into your books. Do pause the video to give you enough time to do that. And while you're doing that, I'll just make sure that you understand what this table actually means. So you can see within the table, each of these rows here, so they are called the intervals or the classes, okay? And just make sure you understand that mathematical notation that we've got there. That's got some inequalities there. T stands for your time. So what this first interval says is in here are any of the times taken by the students to solve a puzzle that are bigger than 5, so not equal to 5 because there's no equals there. So bigger than 5 but less than or equal to 10. And what this means is there were 2 values that are in that particular interval. Now notice we know there are 2 in there, but we don't know what their values were. They could both be 10, You could have 16, 19. We really don't know what those values are. So that's what I was saying when I was talking about you've lost the individual data items there. But you can see it's quite a handy way of actually storing all of these values. So if we added up how many we had there, if we had all of those up, frequency, we would have had 36 individual values, which is a reasonable number to actually list out individually. So it's much neater in that table. Okay, but let's have a look at what the question is asking us to do. The first thing it says is it's asking us to work out the modal class. Now, if you remember from the statistics stuff you've done before, mode means most. Now notice it says the modal class. What that means is which of these intervals has got the most numbers recorded in it. So what we're doing for that is we're basically looking at which of these has the highest frequency. Okay, so really easy to spot because the numbers are already put in order because we put them in this table, and we can pick out the one that's got the biggest frequency. Now notice when we mention about the modal, it's not saying an individual value, all it's saying is the mode is within this class. So that's going to be your answer for that particular question. Okay, let's look at part B then. The class containing the median. Do you remember what the median is? The median is the middle value. Okay, and it's the middle value once they are put in order. But again, we've already ordered all of these values, so we don't need to actually do that. All we need to do is find out which is the middle one. Now, we've already added up how many numbers we've got in our table, and it's 36 values. So which is the middle one? Now, when you've got an even number of values, you haven't got an exact middle, but you know it is between the 18th and the 19th value. So we need to now work out in which of these intervals is the 18th and the 19th values. So they're already ordered. So what we can do is we can have a look at the frequencies and we can kind of add them up as we go along until we get to the 18th and the 19th one. So in this first interval, there's going to be 2 values. Okay, first interval, there's 2 values. Up to the end of the second interval, there's 2 plus 14, which is 16 values. And up to the end of this third interval, 2 plus 14 plus 13, which gives me 29 values. Now we were after the 18th and the 19th ones, so they are going to be in here somewhere. So when we're looking at which class contains the median, we know that it's going to be within that class, which we write down as 15 less than t less than or equal to 20. Okay, final thing we want to do is work out an estimate for the mean. Now remember why that's an estimate for the mean. It's because we haven't got the individual values, we haven't got the individual data items here anymore. All we know is that there's 2 within that interval, 14 within that interval, 13 within that interval, etc. like that. So we don't know what those values are. So to get an estimate for the mean, what we do is we assume that those values are right in the middle of that interval. So when we're calculating the mean, what we're going to do first is we're going to identify what the midpoints are of each of the intervals. So the midpoint of the first one is going to be 7.5, second one 12.5, third one 17.5, etc. And then we're going to assume that the values that are in that interval are all at that midpoint value. So you can see what you'll do if the question doesn't already have these columns added on. What you will do is add these columns onto your table. You will specify what the midpoint is. And then the reason I'm doing 7.5 times 2 is that the midpoint is 7.5 and I'm assuming both of these 2 values are 7.5. So I'm going to do 2 of those. I'm going to do 14 at 12.5, 13 at 7.5, etc., etc., and add them all up. And I get this total of 580. So that is a total of all of my values of times taken. Now be careful what you divide by. Okay, you need to divide by how many numbers you had. How many numbers you had was 36. That was a total frequency. And when I do that and put that in my calculator, 580 divided by 36, I get 16.1 to 3 significant figures. And always have a look back. Does that seem sensible? Yeah, because there's a lot of values within 10 to 15. There's a lot of values within 15 to 20. So I know that my mean is going to be somewhere within those two intervals. So it makes sense for it to be about 16.1. Okay, right. Hopefully that will make sense to you with that example. Right, the final thing that we need to do for this particular lesson is looking at comparing two sets of data. So you'll be given two sets of data and you want to compare them. Sometimes the question will specifically say by calculating an estimate for the mean, compare them, something like that. If it doesn't, then there are two things that we need to make sure we look at. So two different aspects of the data that can show differences between them. Now the first one is comparing a measure of average. So the average measurements are mean, median, or mode. So any of those three will indicate a measure of average. So on average, what the values within that data are like, whether they're big, whether they're small, that kind of thing. So that's one side of the data, and that's looking on average at the individual values themselves. Now the other thing that you can have a look at is the consistency or the variation within the data. And what we do to look at that is we look at what's called a measure. This is called a measure of spread. So it's basically saying how spread out the data is. Okay, and the only measure of spread we've sort of done at the moment is the range. When we go on to our next few lessons, we're going to look at something called the interquartile range, which is another measure of spread. So we'll calculate both of those and we can use those to compare the data sets. Now here's the important bit to make sure you get the marks for the questions that you do in an exam or the questions you do from the book. You must make sure when you answer these or you compare the two sets of data that your answer is in context. So what that means is you don't just say the mean of one is this and the mean of this, the other one is this. You have to say what that actually means. So an example I've given here is I've said, it might be some ages. I said group A are older on average. So this is my measure of average. Group A are older on average because their mean age is 45.6 compared to 41.9. So I've specifically quoted what the two calculations for that average are, but then I've said within context what it means, and it means that they are older on average. It's really important that you do this because that's what the examiner is looking for to give you all of the marks for that particular question. Okay, so two things to compare, a measure of average and a measure of spread. Okay, so let's have a look at one example for doing this. So I have got two sets of data here. Always have a read to see what the data is all about. It's about ages of people attending a couple of concerts. Okay, so we've got the two ages of people, the two sort of ranges of ages there. And all the question says is it says compare the ages. So they are looking for you to compare two things. They are looking for you to compare a measure of average. Remember that is mean, median or mode. Any of those will do. And they're looking for you to compare the measure of spread. Okay, and that's going to be our range. So when it's in a group frequency table like this, by far the easiest measure of average to look at is going to be the mode. Because if I have a look at these, it's very easy looking down the frequency column to see which frequency column is the biggest, which row has the biggest frequency in it, and then also for the second one, which row has the biggest frequency in. So that tells you for the top table that on average, according to the mode, the ages are between 30 and 40 for badness, and they are between 20 and 30 for cloud play. So we can quote those two things But remember, we must answer in context. So the sort of thing that we're looking to say for this is the modal ages for badness is larger than for cold play. Okay, and I've specified them, I've missed a bracket out there. So it's between 30 and 40 versus between 20 and 30. And here's my context bit, meaning the spectators of badness were on average older. Okay, so that's your important in context bit, because I've said the age, you know, the age it's bigger, but what does that mean? It means that they were older. Okay, right, so that's my measure of average. I also need to do my measure of spread. Now, to do my measure of spread, I want to look at the range or how varied these are. Now, I don't know where the exact values are. So for each of these, I can have a look at what would be the biggest possible range and what would be the smallest possible range. Okay, so for my badness, the smallest possible value I could have is going to be 20. Okay, that's the really small, and the biggest possible value I could have would be 69. Okay, so if I have a look at that, okay, so I'm looking at the difference between 20 and 69. Okay, so that would give me my biggest range. So for badness, okay, my biggest range, right, is going to be 69, which is the biggest value I could possibly have there, minus the smallest value I could have there, which is going to be 49. Okay. Now, if I think about the smallest range I could have for badness, now the smallest range I could have for badness, well, if I had all of those values right up at the top end of here, they would all be 29, right up at my top end. And if I had all of these values right down at my bottom end, they would be 60. Okay, you can see they would all be at 60. So my smallest range is going to be 60 minus 29, okay, which is 31. Now, if I do the same for cloud play there, okay, so if I look at my biggest range, it goes from 50 up to 39. Okay. 15 up to 39, and if I look at my smallest range, it's going to go from 19 up to 30. Okay, so for my cloud play, see the play on words here, very funny. Okay, the biggest needs to have 2 G's, that one should have 2 G's as well. The biggest is going to be 39 minus 15, which is 24, and my smallest range is going to be 30 minus 19, which equals 11. Okay, but what you can see, even if I consider the biggest or the smallest ranges for each of them, that badness is always has a bigger number than cloud play range. Now, here's the thinking about in context what that means. Okay, the badness range is bigger. What does that mean though? That means the ages are more varied or more spread out. So when we're looking at putting it in context, that should be an equal sign there, there is more variation in the ages of the people at badness because the smallest range is 31 versus the largest range for cloud play being 24. Okay, so this is your in context bit. There's more variation in the ages. So that is what you're looking to say to make sure that you get all of the marks for this question. Okay, right, hopefully that's all made sense to you. If you're not sure of any of that, the joy of having a video is you can rewind, you can replay, you can go through it all again. So please do that if there was anything you didn't understand. Right, if you're okay with that then, Not loads of questions, just questions 2 and 4 on page 16.1a, page 319, that exercise. Couple of questions. I would like you to copy out the tables, add the extra columns on when you're working out the mean, like we did. You needed the midpoint and you needed the midpoint times the frequency. So copy out the extra columns and answer all parts of both of those questions. Okay, and what I would like you to do as well is to submit a picture of that, okay, onto Insight, so that your teachers can just see that you have completed it. So just try and fit it all on one page. That would be really handy if you can fit it all on one page in your maths book. So start a clean page, copy both tables onto one page, do all your working on one page, take a single page photo and then upload that onto Insight, and we can just check that you've done it and you're all right with it. Okay, so thank you for listening. Hopefully that's all clear. As I said, if not, please do replay it again. Okay, I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.